In this lesson, we'll address the question, how do cells maintain themselves? Now, in previous lessons, we learned that cells must get energy from their environment. In this scene, we have an energy molecule in the form of glucose being imported into the cell, and a team of proteins will begin to break the chemical bonds of glucose, releasing energy. And we said that what the cell does is it sort of uses this set of proteins in the cell membrane to repackage the energy of glucose into molecules called ATP that have smaller quantities of energy, just the right amount of energy to power the chemistry in the cell. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at what the cell's going to do with that energy. And so we have this scene down here. We'll call this molecular construction. So cells have to build molecules. Cells are made out of molecules, and so they must build molecules. Why do they have to build molecules? Because the molecules inside cells, they can get damaged over time, and so they'll need to be replaced. In addition, if the cell's going to grow, you're going to have to build more molecules to sustain that cell growth. So cells must build the molecules out of which they're made, and that process is going to require an input of energy. So here's the star of the show. This is a protein specialized to bind two different molecules and make a chemical bond between them. So let's just pause there for a second. So here we have our protein here, and we have two molecules. A red molecule, the red triangle, and the green square are going to stick to the protein at these binding sites. So this protein has evolved to perform a very specialized chemical reaction. It has evolved to have a sticky site for the red molecule and a sticky docking site for the green molecule. And the job of the protein is going to be to make a chemical bond between these two molecules. Now, where did these red and green molecules come from? They might have been some basic nutrients in the food that the cell acquired. And a cell makes hundreds of different kinds of proteins that use nutrients to build a diverse set of molecular parts. So just as this protein is specialized to link these two molecules, there's dozens of other proteins that act on other nutrient molecules to make more complex molecules. So cells make a diverse array of proteins that perform a diverse array of chemical reactions. Now, the proteins make chemical bonds by forcing the reacting molecules to share electrons. And the cell must have chemical energy to power this chemistry. So we'll call the red and the green molecule, the reactants. And down here on the right, we see what's going to happen is the protein is going to make a chemical bond between those reactants, forming the product of the reaction. But that process requires an input of chemical energy. And again, we're in the scene here. Where's that energy coming from? ATP. So the cell has to constantly be getting energy, repackaging that energy in the form of ATP molecules, and it's these ATP molecules that will be supplying the energy to do the chemical reactions that are so important to life for a cell. Now, why do these proteins need ATP energy? Well, we'll use this example of the water molecule to illustrate this. So we have an oxygen atom here and two hydrogen atoms. Now, in the molecule, the oxygen atom is sharing a pair of electrons with one hydrogen atom and sharing a pair of electrons with another hydrogen atom. But if we think about what it takes to form a chemical bond between hydrogen and oxygen, if we pull this hydrogen atom away, we'll see that as we bring the hydrogen atom close to the oxygen atom, the electrons in the atom are going to begin to repel each other. And so we're going to need to force these atoms together to make a chemical bond. So what happens is, as the atoms get closer and closer, the nucleus of the oxygen atom will be able to attract the electron of the hydrogen, and likewise the proton of the hydrogen nucleus there can attract one of the electrons of the oxygen atom. So to make the chemical bond, you have to force the atoms to get close enough that then they can share their electrons. Well, that takes energy to push atoms together to make a chemical bond. So the external source of energy to power this chemistry is supplied by ATP molecules, which store the energy released from food molecules, as we've seen in earlier lessons. Just to show us what the ATP molecule looks like, its name is adenosine triphosphate. Here's the adenosine part of the molecule. There's a ribose, a sugar unit here, and then it's got these triphosphates, 3 phosphate groups. And it's this chemical bond between the last two phosphates that is a high energy chemical bond. And so from earlier lessons, the idea was that the cell is breaking apart glucose, which has lots of energy, like $30 worth of energy, and repackaging that energy in these bonds right here. So each ATP molecule has the equivalent of $1 worth of energy right there in that chemical bond. Okay, let's see what happens as the protein does its job here. First, we have the two reactant molecules have attached at their docking sites, as well an ATP molecule has attached to the protein as well. And now we'll just transfer the scene over here to this protein down here. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. We've got the two reactants ready to be linked together, and we've got the source of energy, the ATP molecule. So what will happen is that high energy bond is going to be broken, and the released energy is going to be used to make a chemical bond between the two reactant molecules. First of all, to say that the high energy bond is broken, it means that the last phosphate group from the ATP molecule is going to be broken off. And so the breaking of that bond releases energy. If we take a look at the molecules again, if we just compare them side by side, the ATP has 3 phosphates, adenosine triphosphate. ADP has 2 phosphates. And again, we're breaking that last bond, and that's going to release energy. Now, the phosphate group here can end up in a couple of different places. It may end up on one of the reactant molecules itself, or the phosphate group sometimes attaches to the protein itself. And when it attaches to the protein, sometimes that causes a change in the shape of the protein, and that's what is sort of driving the chemical reaction. It's going to push those reactants together so they can form a chemical bond. So different proteins work in different way. We're not going to worry about the details of that. We're just going to think that that as that chemical bond is broken, energy is released, and that energy is going to be used to build the chemical bond between these two reactant molecules. So again, it's like a transfer of energy. The released energy from the ATP, now an ADP molecule, the released energy is going to be, in a sense, harnessed to build the chemical bond between the reactants. And there we have the chemical bond shown here. So the energy released from one chemical reaction is used to drive forward a chemical reaction that requires energy. The energy released from the ATP molecule as it becomes ADP, that energy is used to force these molecules together to make a chemical bond. That process required energy because you have to push those atoms together. The atoms of the reactant molecules have to be pushed close enough together so they make a chemical bond. So in general then, all living cells on Earth must get energy from their environment because it takes energy to make chemical bonds between molecules. Now after this process has happened, the ADP molecule will detach, and now this molecule must go get recharged with energy so it can be used again in the future. And as well, the finished product will detach from the protein, and then that molecule bumps around in the cytoplasm of the cell. Perhaps it's going to be acted upon by another protein. Let's just follow what happens to the ADP back in our cartoon cell here. Here comes the ADP from the site of the construction, and it's going to go back up to the bank, as it were, and another phosphate group will be attached to the ADP, which makes it an ATP molecule. And that reaction of putting another phosphate back on the ADP, that requires energy from food, right? So the cell has to be constantly getting food as a source of energy to power this process of regenerating ATP molecules, the energy currency of the cell. Then the ATP molecule is available for other chemical reactions in the cell. Now, at the end of this process, then, the protein is ready to do another chemical reaction, should it bind 2 more reactants and have a ready supply of ATP. So the protein doesn't get damaged just in the process of doing this chemical reaction. But over time, proteins can accumulate damage, and so they will need to be replaced. And in fact, also, the cell doesn't just make one of each kind of protein. It can make dozens or hundreds of identical proteins. But again, over time, the proteins will be damaged, not by doing the reaction, but just as a result of other interactions in the cell. The proteins themselves accumulate damage, and they will have to be replaced. with new proteins. So for all cells on Earth, we can begin to categorize some of the chemistry going on in the cell. There are lots of chemical reactions involved in doing two basic processes, and we call these chemical reactions metabolism. These are the sets of chemical reactions that sustain the life of the cell. And the two categories might be identified as follows. There's a whole set of chemical reactions involved in getting energy, processing energy, somehow getting energy from the environment. Even if you're photosynthetic, there's lots of chemistry going on involving processing energy in the cell. And then there's a whole other set of chemical reactions involved in building things, the construction processes, as we've just seen in this lesson. So all cells on Earth are doing complex chemistry. They're harnessing energy from their environment, and they're using that energy to build molecules, because cells are made of molecules.